Contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. In times of spiritual and moral chaos, it can be hard to discern truth from error and to apply it to all of life. God's word is not silent, and we don't have to be either. This is Once for All Delivered with Caleb Castro and Andrew Smith.
Welcome to Once for All Delivered, a podcast about things in the general area of Reformed theology and culture and so forth. I am Andrew Smith.
And I'm Caleb Castro.
And we are continuing today an occasional series on comparing catechisms, where we take a look at the Westminster Shorter Catechism with a little help from the larger, and the Heidelberg Catechism in parallel, look at the similarities and differences between them. So if you've been with us thus far, we have gone through Lord's Day 1 and 2 of the Heidelberg, sort of using that as our overarching structure, which then logically brings us into Lord's Day 3, which roughly parallels, along with Lord's Day 4, with questions 11 through 19 of the Shorter Catechism. And then we'll also loop in some parts of the larger catechism too, which basically follows the same order as the Shorter.
So today's topic, which in the structure of the Heidelberg Catechism, Lord's Day 3, is the second of Lord's Day instruction on the first section of the Catechism, that of our sin and misery. Lord's Day 2, if you listen back to the session on that, regards how we come to know our misery, that is our alienation, our separation from God in sin, and how we learn of this in the law. Lord's Day 3 gets into a topic that is not very popular in our days. It deals with the topic of sin. Now, I just want to make a brief note here before we jump into the questions and answers of the Heidelberg and Westminster. You know, sin is overall, it's a difficult thing for man to conceive of rightly, particularly in his natural fallen state. You know, there's really, even for many professing Christians, there's a natural undermining of just how sinful sin really is. There's a depths of our depravity, and that's what we're really picking up here.
I think part of that is we just simply don't know what it's like to be without sin. I mean, none of us were in the garden. We didn't experience paradise and the ability to live without sin, or the state of living without sin. And so it is so strange and foreign to us to even try to conceive of such a thing.
Right.
And also, too, looking at where we've been before. So we introduced the concept of sin and misery before, but where we're looking now is essentially, to put it in the words of the talking heads, how did I get here? How did we end up in this state of sin and misery? This is not my beautiful world that was created good and without sin.
Right. What is the source?
Yeah.
And so Lord's Day 3 puts it very blunt. Just to read only the questions for a moment. Question 6, did God create man so wicked and perverse? Question 7, where does man's corrupt nature come from? And question 8, are we so corrupt that we are totally unable to do any good and inclined towards all evil? So here in question and answer 6, to read the answer now, did God create man so wicked and perverse? No, period. God created man good and in his own image, that is, in true righteousness and holiness, so that he might truly know God as creator, love him with all his heart, and live with God in eternal happiness for his praise and glory. I like to see this in part, this question and answer of the Heidelberg as a true parallel to the Westminster Catechism 1. Because here is where we have the purpose of man's creation, of his nature, the telos, if you will, that he might truly know God as creator, love him with all his heart, and live with God in eternal happiness for his praise and glory. So that is the chief end of man. All right. Now, just a couple keywords here to get us started. And we'll just kind of blitz through this. So here, the Heidelberg in the answer is giving a description of the image of God in which man was created. This image can be found with a couple keywords here. Man was good. There's a purpose towards this goodness. And if I could say first, good, when God said, he looked and saw man and he was very good. This meant that God considered his work, if you will, and saw it as efficacious, that it was in fulfillment with God's plan and purpose. So God is affirming the goodness of his work. That image uses the language of Ephesians 4:24 and Colossians 3:10. It compiles those scripture texts to say that man's image is righteousness, holiness, and knowledge, true knowledge. And so that's what we find in the Catechism. Now, what knowledge does is knowledge tells man, or has man have the ability to know rightly God, his creator. He's also able to understand the natures of the creation around him. We consider how the Lord had the various kinds of animals and fish and birds be put before man, and Adam names them. He discerns their nature, and likewise, man was able to know his neighbor, which we would see when Eve is created from his bone, and he says, "This is the bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh." He understands her nature to be complementary to his.
And this is very similar to what you get in question and answer 10 of the Shorter Catechism, so I'll go ahead and read that. It's, how did God create man? So bearing in mind that the Westminster treats sin and misery later, as we looked at before in the Catechism, it doesn't come in as the Heidelberg does, assuming that you've already been introduced to sin and misery. It starts with man in his good state. So the answer to that question is God created man, male and female, so adding the distinction of the sexes to what the Heidelberg talked about. And then after his own image, in knowledge, righteousness, and holiness, so very similar to what we've seen in question 6 of the Heidelberg. And then it also adds with dominion over the creatures. So again, it's using that language of Ephesians 4 and Colossians 3, true knowledge, righteousness, and holiness. And just as a plug here, if you haven't already, you can go back and listen to what we were doing early on in our Christianity and Culture series on nature and grace. We did talk in some detail about the image of God and the various issues that go into that. So, for instance, we critiqued Meredith Klein's view of the image of God as purely judicial and other things. So we had a more detailed discussion of the image back there if you'd like to go hear that. But anyway, and then also similarly talking about the telos, we have question 12. So in between the two, there's question 11, which talks about providence generally, and we'll come back to that another time because the Heidelberg has a much more detailed treatment of providence as well. But question 12 is, what special act of providence did God exercise toward man in the estate wherein he was created? And this answer is, when God had created man. So note the sequence here. Note, God created man. Then he entered into a covenant of life with him. So the covenant of life, also known elsewhere in the standards as the covenant of works, upon condition of perfect obedience, forbidding him to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, upon the pain of death. So getting into the essentially how did man fall, which Heidelberg 7 will get into. This sets out the terms of the covenant of works, which is the covenant that by the transgression of man did fall into sin. So we're seeing very similar things in how the Westminster and the Heidelberg treat these issues. That God created man good in his image, and then what constitutes that image. This is what theologians, like I can think of Louis Berkhoff as one example, talks about. This is the image of God in the narrower sense, which is lost in the fall. Again, we discussed this a little more in detail back in our Christianity and culture stuff, so you can get that there. But yeah.
Yeah, and just a fast note for closing out question answer 6. We see how this concept of what true righteousness is and holiness is speaking of the true relationship to God and able to then fulfill what is required of him, as we'll speak of in a moment. Man being able to truly know God means that he can know and understand his law, and he can rightly then serve him or correctly serve him, and that's righteousness. Likewise, he's able to entirely devote himself, his whole person, his whole being, if you will, head, heart, and hands, to God in purity. Man didn't have a disposition that only pulled towards doing sin like he would after the fall, or once he sinned. He had a desire, a will that is able to faithfully love and serve God, and that is holiness. And what the references in both the Westminster Shorter Catechism and the Heidelberg in speaking of true righteousness, holiness, and knowledge, this is gleaned from how Ephesians 4:24 and Colossians 3:10 speak about man's nature renewed in Christ. And so it is inferred that Adam had righteousness, holiness, and knowledge, which that's a whole further and deeper conversation that could be detailed. But the base is that having this knowledge, righteousness, and holiness means that man could serve God wholeheartedly with a true and sincere love. And so the law and obeying it in the garden, and even after the fall, really, obedience to the law is truly love for God. And then likewise, as will be explained in the second great commandment, it's also a love for neighbor. So the law is love. In order to do that, man must imitate God, who is himself love. So we see how the massive problem then is introduced with man's fall.
Before we go on into that, though, I do just want to add something briefly, because I don't know if we'll come back to it. The Westminster does add the line about dominion over the creatures. The Heidelberg really doesn't get into that. I think the Belgic does, if I remember correctly. So it's still in there in the three forms of unity. But it is important to point that out. There is a concern, there is an interest in man's dominion over the creatures, which, by the way, while it is marred and damaged at the fall, does not go away. For instance, it's changed. So, for instance, like there is a certain ways in which creatures can make life very difficult for man and harm him and such. But I've been actually preaching through Genesis here at my church in South Dakota, and we recently looked at the Noahic covenant, and what you see in the Noahic covenant in the post-fall world is the dominion mandate restated. Dominion over the creatures, restraint of the creatures, the fear of creatures. And then another text that I actually preached this one at Presbytery last fall is Psalm 8, where you see David very much praising God for the continuation of dominion that man exercises over creation. And this is important because there's a lot of teaching in our day that seeks to downplay and mitigate dominion. And we've talked about dominion elsewhere in our Christ and Culture series as well. But it's just important to keep to mind the concept of dominion and how important it is, and how not only the fall, but also the gospel, the coming of Christ and everything, does not obliterate, does not change the dominion mandate.
In this way, the dominion mandate is somewhat implied. It's implicit in question and answer 6. I wouldn't say it's necessarily taught explicitly there. But when we consider the language of righteousness, holiness, and knowledge, this image is an equipping for the threefold office or duty of man. And that is knowledge, to know his creator as a prophet, and then to also teach his posterity, if he were to multiply, about who God is, what he's like, and so on. He was to love him with all his heart. In that devotion would be serving him as a priest, everything that he does being an offering to the Lord. And then to also live with him in eternal happiness, exercising the obedience to the law in righteousness, as a king, so judging and ruling in service of the Lord. So man, in this way, having this threefold reflection of the Lord's own, a sign even of the Lord's own sovereignty, we could say. He was the crown of creation, of existence, and with this threefold office, he would serve as the Lord's official deputy, his vice regent, managing creation. And again, that management as a sign of God's own sovereignty. And all he had to do in maintaining that, I say all he had, was obey the Lord and to love him. And so that's where, this next part on, say, the Heidelberg in question 7 hits next. Man's corrupt nature comes from the fall and disobedience of our first parents, Adam and Eve, in paradise. The fall so poisoned our nature that we are all conceived and born in sin. And Andrew's already started to touch on that from the Westminster Catechism. If you want to take up what happened with that disobedience.
Yeah, so this is question 13. Did our first parents continue in the estate wherein they were created? The answer is our first parents, being left to the freedom of their own will, fell from the estate wherein they were created by sinning against God. And then a couple of other questions follow up on that. So question 14, what is sin? Sin is any want of conformity unto or transgression of the law of God, so treating sin generally. And then question 15, what was the sin whereby our first parents fell from the estate wherein they were created? The sin whereby our first parents fell from the estate wherein they were created was their eating the forbidden fruit. And then finally, did all mankind fall in Adam's first transgression? And the answer, the covenant being made with Adam, not only for himself, but for his posterity, all mankind, descending from him by ordinary generation, sinned in him and fell with him in his first transgression. And I think we could go on because it's still related, but probably come back under question 8 to the subsequent questions that further treat the fall and the state of misery that comes with it. So essentially, while the Westminster puts it in more explicitly covenantal terms, with the Heidelberg, the covenant theology is generally more implicit. I mean, it's there, but it doesn't say there's this covenant and then that covenant. The Westminster does speak of it in those terms, the covenant being made with Adam and how he fell and how his sin is imputed to all of his descendants. We have here the introduction of the concept of original sin, which we come back to in more detail in question 18. And the state of sin and misery that comes not just to Adam, but to all of us through him.
Now, what question answer 7 is getting at is that doctrine of original sin. And it probably most closely parallels question 16 of the Shorter Catechism in its direct purpose in what it's looking to teach. So original sin is what is being implied, though not using that term. First is that this knowledge of original sin and that man has a corrupt nature is revealed by God through the law. And so the law is what brings that knowledge of sin. Second is that man had a free will, as Andrew had read from, which question answer was it?
That would be 13, our first parents being left to the freedom of their own will.
Yeah, so the freedom of their will. Just a fast note on that. This refers to man's inclinations, his disposition, a desiring. Man doesn't have, even in the garden, we can say, an absolute libertarian free will, in that man could still be swayed and pulled by emotions, by impulse, by external influence, as in the case of the serpent's deceit and lies. Only God has that absolute libertarian, unrestrained will, not being swayed by his own, by passions, impulse, or external influence.
Just to interject, we're not talking about libertarian in the political sense, which is what most people would understand attached to that word now. But we're talking about libertarian as in having full liberty, having complete freedom.
And that's what's important to note here. Man does not have absolute unhindered freedom. He's able to be swayed by the serpent in sin. And that's part of the problem. Even in this state of prelapsarian state of purity, he is able to sin. He is able to fall. So man is not perfect. The garden is not a perfect final state. And so when the renewal of all things in the new heavens and new earth comes, we're not going to revert to like a state of the Garden of Eden in paradise. That's what the Lutherans teach. That's not the ultimate existence, if you will. That said, man has a free will, which is ability to desire God and obey him. But he chose not to do what God commanded. That's what his freedom would lead him to. He chose, both he and Eve, chose to listen to the lies of the serpent and then not rebuke the serpent or rebuff him, but instead to twist the words and commands of God and go into sin. And what this sin and taking of the fruit that was forbidden, this shows that, one, man intentionally disobeyed. God explicitly told him what not to do and what to do in what he's able to partake of in the garden. And he told him not to have the fruit of that one tree. It's crystal clear. The command God gave was not anything beyond what Adam could handle. We had already said he was entirely equipped with the faculties and the image of God in true righteousness, holiness, and knowledge to obey. And God even warned him of the consequence if he took of the fruit ahead of time. You shall surely die. So it's right there. He totally understood and knew what God said not to do and what would happen. So it is an intentional, deliberate disobedience. And Therefore, Adam, rather than acting in knowledge, acts in folly and foolishness. And that is where the misery and separation from God begins. It's in the fall, in alienation. And the very life and existence of man's faculties, man's nature, is flipped on its head. Rather than being in a covenant relationship or fellowship with God, he enters into a covenant or fellowship or relationship under Satan. His knowledge turns into a foolishness. His righteousness turns to wickedness, and his holiness into impurity, and a desire to not devote himself to God. So man, then, in his corruption, looks more like Satan's nature. There are small glimmerings, remnants of the light of the image. Man still has a reason. Man still has a general sense of morality. Man is still something of a general will. But all those things now are inclined only to doing evil. Like say when you have your car is out of alignment and it only pulls to the right side of the road. It tugs over there no matter what you do in trying to correct the wheel. It keeps tugging over there. Well, this is the same of sorts, if we're to use analogy.
Yeah, another issue that can come up here when we're talking about the fall, because it's often, and I know this because I came up through like the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement, and it's often very reductionist treatment of Reformed theology is, I would hear it often spoken of as, well, Calvinists don't believe in free will and Arminians do believe in free will. And that's not really true. That's not really correct. As we see here in our confessional standards, we see it here in the Shorter Catechism, and then actually the Westminster Confession devotes an entire chapter to this free will. Adam and Eve did have properly understood a free will. And even we, though fallen, we have a free will to a point. It's stained by sin. It's like that misaligned car. It's always going to pull a certain way. We're not able not to sin any longer, but we do still, as rational and moral beings, make real choices that matter. Now, it's all according to God's secret decree and his purposes, and ultimately for his glory. But at the end of the day, we do, in a real way, do have and exercise will.
There's a second phrase here in question and answer 7 that says, the first part had said, well, where does the corrupt nature come from? And the second part, though, now speaks directly to that corrupt nature, saying, this fall has so poisoned our nature that we are all conceived and born in sin. And again, this points at the doctrine of original sin, but in another way, it also speaks to what original sin is. Now, original sin has two aspects to it, of what we call original guilt and original pollution. Now, this question and answer speaks more to what original pollution is, but we can perhaps note both really quick.
This would be a good time to look at question 18 of the Shorter.
That was going to ask, actually.
Yeah, which is, wherein consists the sinfulness of that estate whereinto man fell? The answer is, the sinfulness of that estate whereinto man fell consists in the guilt of Adam's first sin, the want of original righteousness, and the corruption of his whole nature. So there you have that pollution element, which is commonly called original sin, together with all actual transgressions which proceed from it. So yeah, in question 18, we see these two facets of original sin, the guilt and the pollution. We also see here that we have the guilt of original sin, but then also this original sin serves as the basis for all of our own sins, our actual personal sins that we commit. It's not as though the two can be so neatly separated. So, for instance, Roman Catholics teach that in your baptism, your original sin is washed away, and then you're able to do meritorious works, and you're able to essentially not sin. I don't really know how they come up with that. And then if you do sin, then you have to go do confession and penance and all that kind of stuff. It's clearly original sin remains, because it is from our original sin that all our actual sins proceed.
Isn't it a restoration of sorts of the superadded gift?
As far as I understand, yes.
Yeah.
That essentially baptism puts you back where Adam was, and then you can do what he could have done.
Right. So it's...
But then we don't.
Like in the garden, we spoke a little bit about this in one of our... Actually, it might have been the first or second episode on talking about nature and grace. Mm-hmm. How man is basically, for the Roman Catholics, man is created and has general faculties, intellect, affection, and will. But God then adds the element of grace to him to obey. And so...
to restrain concupiscence.
Right.
To restrain man's inclination to sin.
Right. So already there in the garden, you have a nature plus grace, whereas here in the Reformed position, we're saying that with man's creation and the breath of life put into him, that is when man is endowed with the image of God, of righteousness, holiness, and knowledge as part of him, even then as part of his nature. But here, and this is the problem, that nature is corrupted. And another way to also talk about this doctrine of original sin is perhaps what's a little bit more familiar in Reformed terms. It's the doctrine of total depravity, which is another one that's misunderstood by Arminians and other camps. The concept of depravity or corruption is another way to say it. Total corruption is that when people hear the word total, they think man is absolutely, without qualification, corrupted. They think that's what the Reformed are teaching. So that man cannot do any sort of kind of good, like digging a well in Africa as part of the Peace Corps or whatever, cannot be considered good, a good thing. It's not quite what we're getting at, what the Reformed are getting at in talking about depravity. We're saying that man's faculties holistically are corrupted. We had implied it earlier in talking about how righteousness turns to foolishness, affections towards impurity, and righteousness to wickedness. So that at its base, because man will not do any action to the glory of God and the benefit of his neighbor over himself, he cannot do any good work. And we use that illustration of the car alignment. Mm-hmm. So depravity is talking about a general, it's speaking to the disposition of our wickedness.
It is total in that it affects all mankind and it affects the whole man. But I often hear it as this distinction between total depravity and utter depravity. Total depravity in that, everyone is depraved and all of our person is corrupted by sin, but we're not utterly depraved in that we are not as wicked as we potentially could be. There is still these shattered remnants of the image in us that incline us to doing some good, even if we do it badly and if we do it for wrong reasons. Even our best works are stained with sin and corrupted. But also, God's general restraint of wickedness. We've kind of hit on this before too, even talking about like the second use of the law and things like that. And the law of God written on the hearts, even the worst of pagans still retain some semblance of morality. It's, again, often very corrupted. You think of all the, You think of how like ancient pagan tribes engaged in human sacrifice and things of that sort. And obviously this corruption can go pretty far, but it is limited in a certain extent, because if we were utterly depraved, if we were completely evil all the time, I mean, we would do nothing but destroy ourselves and destroy the world around us.
Well, there's a great illustration on this from J. van Bruggen, a Dutch minister in the 20th century for the gereformeerde kerken, the vrijgemaakt, the liberated Article 31 churches in the Netherlands. He speaks about how, well, I'll just quote him here. Now, the Lord uses general, natural, civil, outward, moral actions. He uses them to ensure that society does not fall apart, like you said a moment ago, Andrew, in the civil sense of the law, in the general curbing of wickedness in society. But in all these things, man does not fulfill the law of the Lord, for he does not do them in love of the Lord. This is evident from the story about the building of the Tower of Babel. Men did, quote unquote, good to each other in that situation. They did not fight each other, but helped each other in complete harmony. What peace and prosperity! But in the process, they helped each other unanimously to forget God and to resist his commandment. Thus, they hated God while doing good toward each other. So there's still something that could be considered in a anthropological, very general anthropological sense, good works unto each other, but does not fulfill the law of God and therefore is against God. Going back a moment to original sin, just want to make a note on original guilt. This basically means that all people bear our first parents' guilt of disobedience. And people can think, well, why is that fair? Why do I have to suffer? They're the ones that messed it up for all of us. How can God threaten us with eternal punishment for something someone else did? And this is because this is the importance of understanding the covenant of works. Adam was the head, the representative of all man, who was in him, in his seed. All man would come from Adam. And so as the representative of man, his sin is counted as ours. Romans 5:12 says, sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin. And so death spread to all men because all sinned. And then there's that original pollution, second consequence of original sin. And this is exactly what question and answer 7 says. The poisoning of our nature from conception, even as David would say in Psalm 51:5, that we are all corrupted. Genesis 5:3 says that Adam fathered a son in his own likeness. That in that verse, it doesn't place the emphasis of Adam having a son in the likeness of God, but now in his own like nature, which is a fallen nature. Original pollution speaks to that actual total corruption. Not just that God counts the guilt of Adam's sin to us, but also that original sin taints us, like dropping a drop of pure black India ink into a glass of water. It is so filled, that glass of water, that it is black.
Or like, for instance, if somebody dropped a drop of cyanide in that glass of water, you're not going to want to drink it. Even if it's just a little bit of it, it's so all corrupting that it's deadly.
Well, that's all the time that we have. Thanks for joining us for this episode. We're still trying out this pithy sign-off from our friend Mark Scaturo. Thanks for joining us on Once for All Delivered, where we hope to faithfully deliver until we're all delivered.
Fiend.
And scene.
Thank you for listening to this episode. For the latest news and updates, visit our Substack at onceforalldelivered.com, where you can also support our work with a paid subscription. You can also follow us on social media at OFAD Podcast. If you like what you have heard, leave a 5-star review where you get your podcasts, and spread the word about the show. Once for All Delivered is hosted by Andrew Smith and Caleb Castro, and produced by Andrew and Heidi Smith. A special thank you to our founding members, Eric and Kathy Hepker. We hope you will join us again next time on Once for All Delivered.
No, that is all that we have time for. We thank you for joining us on Once for All Delivered, and here we hope to faithfully deliver. Goodness, I can't. I read the word wrong. Okay, one more time. Sorry, Heidi. Hi.
Caleb can't read.
I can't. Oh, yeah.
It's a problem.
So we're picking up, trying out the suggested pithy sign-off phrase from our friend Mark Scaturo. So, thanks for all. Wow. Bloopers. Okay, one more time.
Like I said, can't read.